Just a few more weary days and then I'll fly away to a land where joy shall never end. I'll fly away.
It's not so nice to think about being an antique. I remember I was in Africa, chairman of the foreign missions, for a trip, and we were going down the river to baptize some people. And I saw an old person going along, grouping, and looked very, very old. And I said to one of the missionaries, "How old is this person supposed?" He said, "I don't know, but I'll find out." And he walked over there and talked to him. He came back, he said, "Brother Paulk, he doesn't know. But I'll tell you now, too long." So we went about 600 or 800 miles in the other direction. This seemed to be a coincidence, and we were going down for another baptizing. And I saw another man. This is hard to believe, but it is the truth. And I saw another man grouping along, and I said to another missionary, "How old is this person?" He said, "I don't know, I'll ask him." So he went and asked, and came back and said, "He doesn't know how old he is, but too long." So it's been nice to have been associated with this church, and I appreciate it so very much. I got a lift this morning, telephone rang, and the voice was speaking and said, "I'm a member of the faculty over at Lee." Yes, and I said, "I know who the voice is, none other than Brother James L. Slade." And he was telling me how wonderful the message was, as he said. That's Brother Slade's way of saying things to make you feel good. And how great the message was yesterday morning. Said, "You made the order for these kids," as he said. And he said, I said, "Will you be there this morning?" He said, "I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world." Now, you know, that made me feel really good, and I appreciate it a lot. Separate and apart from what I want to continue to talk about this morning, I want to throw in something here that will be extra and won't cost you anything extra. But the word of admonition, if I may be worthy of giving you admonition, that as a young person going out at the face of the world, one of the things I've found to be helpful is to be yourself. Don't try to be anyone else, but just be yourself by the grace of God. I mean by that, like the Apostle Paul said in the 15th chapter, 1 Corinthians, the 9th and 10th verse, he said, "I am the least of the apostles, that are not meet to be called an apostle, because I persecute the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. And his grace was not bestowed upon me in vain. For I labored more abundantly than they all. Yet not I, but the grace of God is with me." By the grace of God, just be yourself and depend on God. The difference is God's help and God's grace. I am what I am by the grace of God. I remember in my early ministry when I came to headquarters and they sent me, one of my first conventions was New York City State Convention. And I had not been north to any extent, and I was a little dubious and a little excited, I suppose. And I went into that hall. They had rented to have a state convention, and they introduced me, and I got up there and I said, "Listen, I'm Earl Paulk. I'm from South Georgia. I'm a Georgia cracker." And I said, "I won't be satisfied when I die unless they bury me in South Georgia, where the raccoons and the alligators can walk over my grave. And if so, then I'll be happy." They said, "Whoo!" And they accepted me, and I had them in my hands from then on. So this morning I want to continue our talk of yesterday morning, my call into the ministry, and how God has walked with me as a companion, if I should dare say God being a companion to a human being. But he walked with Enoch. Genesis 5:24, he walked with Enoch, and Enoch was not, because God took him. And I want to tell you, not to the extent that he walked with Enoch, I don't suppose, but God has certainly walked with me, for which I'm eternally grateful. And any little thing that I might accomplish in the ministry has been by the help and the grace of God. Now, continuing the thought of yesterday morning, I was appointed state overseer of South Carolina. Brother Tharp was pastoring Tremont Avenue. At the end of this year, they wanted Brother Tharp to go to the Bible school at Sevierville. And he said, I don't have time to go into any details, you understand. But he said, under one condition. They said, the executive committee said, what is that? Said, if you release Brother Paulk and let him take Tremont Avenue. Well, they said, if that's the only alternative, okay. So the executive committee contacted me and said, we're well pleased with your work here as an overseer, but told me the circumstances, and we want you, Brother Tharp's not willing to go to the school unless you take Tremont. I said, never, never. I can't follow a man like Zeno C. Tharp. That's just out. I can't do it. Well, it goes without saying, they kept on and persuaded me, and then I had a little talk with Adam A. Now, Adam A. is my sweetheart. And I told her, she said, Earl Paulk, you can do it. If Zeno C. Tharp can do it, by the help of God, you can do it too. Don't you say no, you take it. And so I did. I took it. And God began to bless. Pour out His Spirit. One of the first fine brick churches has been erected by Brother Tharp. And the people began to come in graciously and wonderfully and overflow. And, of course, the church did grow, and it doubled in membership. And I'll throw this in a little ahead of time. And the tithes, in the course of time, the tithes began to increase tremendously. So much so, when I went to the assembly, I told them, this is too much money for one man to get. I guess if I'd have kept my mouth shut and went on, I could have been a rich man. I'm certainly not that today. But anyhow, I went to the General Assembly and proposed a motion that we put the pastors, if it reached over a certain amount, on a salary. And that's why we have that salary today. But anyhow, God poured His Spirit out. Got to where the church wouldn't hold the people. And I'll tell you, one Sunday morning my heart was moved. There's hundreds of people just raining and couldn't get into church and had to go home. I said, I knew that J.P. Morgan owned a lot of mills in Greenville, who was a member of the President's cabinet. And I wanted to see Mr. Henry, who was the head man next to Mr. J.P. Morgan. He was his trusted man, and next man was Mr. Harold Turner. And I said to somebody, do you suppose I could see Mr. Henry? Said, not a chance. Nobody sees Henry here. Said he stays in New York most of the time. Well, I just thought about it, and I didn't even tell no one, not even mad at me, I was going to call him, because if I failed, I didn't want anybody to know it. And so I got off and made me a speech up. I called and his office, and the secretary asked, Mrs. Hart was her name. She said, Mrs. Hart speaking, and I said, is Mr. Henry in? Yes. May I speak with him? Well, may I tell him who's asking? I said, Reverend Paulk, the pastor of the Church of God, and our church is right close to one of their mills. And she said, I'll see. Mr. Henry was a man of few words, and I like that. And he picked up the telephone and said, Henry talking. I said, Mr. Henry, I'm Earl P. Paulk, pastor of the Church of God, Tremont Avenue. Yes, sir. What can I do for you? I said, may I have an appointment with you? May I have an appointment with you for 60 seconds? I heard him breathing deep. He said, 60 seconds? I said, 60 seconds. He said, I don't see why I shouldn't see you 60 seconds. I said, okay, sir, when? He said, 1 o'clock. I roached my hair. I went over there, and I was sitting there, and Mrs. Hart said, are you Reverend Paulk? I said, I'm Reverend Paulk. Said, Mr. Henry's ready for you. I walked down the hall to the last office, and it was lined with the finest wood, one of the finest offices I'd ever been in. Have a seat, Reverend Paulk. I sat down. I talked to him 45 seconds. I knew exactly what I was going to say. In 45 seconds, I told him. I said, Mr. Henry, your people's my people. And I said, on last Sunday, I said, hundreds came and couldn't get in because there's not room to take your people in. He said, I heard about it. And I said, I want to start a building program. And if you can help us, I would be eternally grateful. And that's about the substance of what I said. I only used 45 seconds. He looked at me, twisted his chair. There's a door open. He said, Mrs. Hart, come in here. Didn't say it. That's all he said. Mrs. Hart, come in here. She came, walked into the end of the table, said, go write this man a check for $500. Said, any man can be to the point like that deserves my help, our help. He said, you see that door? I said, yes, sir. He said, from now on, don't you call to make an appointment with me. You take the liberty to just walk down the hall and walk in here. I had it made. Had it made? I want to tell you how much did I have it made. About the burning of the church, I want to tell you what happened. But soon after that, Mr. Harold Turner called me and said, Reverend, can you come over to my office? I said, yes, sir. When they called me, I knew to go. And so I went. He said, we are honored today, and we've talked to Mr. J.P. Morgan. He's here in person. He wants to meet you. We've told him about your work. I said, I'm delighted. And so I had the pleasure and the honor of meeting him personally. And I talked with him and bid him adieu and went on and told him how wonderful and that I was honored and so forth and so on. And then he said, okay, we'll be in touch with you. And I went on my way, and then Mr. Henry called me back to the office, said, I got something to tell you. Said, Mr. J.P. Morgan told me, whenever you need help of any kind, don't spare. Help that man. Whatever he needs, help him, and I'll be back of you. What does that mean? The morning the church burned, I want to tell you now. I want to tell you about that. They called me. Mr. Turner said, Reverend, we eternally, is an eternal regret in our heart about your church burning. Because now, I was fixing, I went, and they had given me the money. In other words, I went over, and when that church burned, they gave me a check for $58,000. All because I held my appointment to 45 seconds. Whenever you go to see a businessman, a man of importance, don't go in details and your preliminaries. Get to the point, get it said, and get done. And get out of the way. And he'll call you back. All right, about the church burning, I built a church there by their help. There was a twin church exactly like the one was sitting there. Exactly. Twin fronts. And then I decided the Sunday school grew so much until I put on an addition back, on the back of it there, I forget, 25 Sunday school rooms. And we'd only been in there 2 Sundays. I was sleeping with a telephone beside my bed. It rang at 2 o'clock, and Earl Jr. was living across the street from the church going to Furman. He said, Daddy? I said, yes, son. He said, I hate to tell you, but the church is burning. I said, no. Oh, Daddy said it's burning. I jumped up and I told Adam A., my sweetheart, I said, you call the fire departments, but I didn't know they beat me there. And so I went. 2 o'clock, I got there about a little after 2 o'clock, and the people were gathering, and by 4 o'clock, there was thousands of people there. The church, great church, was burning. I don't know, and the children on the Mill Village came by the hundreds, and they found out where I was, and they got around me. The grown people couldn't get close to me, but the children were right around me. And it kept burning. When the roof of the thing fell in, it sounded like thunder. And those little children went down on their knees. They screamed, oh, Brother Paulk, where will we go to church? Where will we go to church? That got the best of me. I broke loose from the children, walked out in the dark, and Earl Jr. was concerned about me, and he found me standing, leaning up against a telegraph post, and he said, Daddy, I know this is hard, and I know we can't understand it, but don't you fear. God is with us, and God will help us to build back a greater than we had before. That meant so much. I spread my shoulders out, and I walked out, and one of the first men I came to was Charlie Daniels. Charlie Daniels was one of the greatest builders of America. You know, President Eisenhower had him in his office one of his terms, his term when he's president, and it was on CBS, and I saw it, and of course I was interested in Charlie Daniels, and he gave him a certificate as being one of the greatest builders in America. Well, the first man I met was Charlie Daniels. I come out, and he had heard, and he came down. Charlie Daniels said, Reverend, he whispered in my ear, don't you worry, we'll build your church back. And while he's talking to me, he had way of slipping something in your pocket. He'd slip, different times we'd be talking to him, he'd slip something in his shirt pocket. I wouldn't look then, but when he got away, I looked, and always, it would always be $100 bill, every time. But anyhow, he slipped something in my pocket that morning, and when I got a chance to look at it, it's a check for $1,200. He said, when you get to where you can this morning, come down to my office. And so the story is that they gave me money. When I went to the house, I had every pocket full of money, every pocket. And they'd come up and poke money in my back pockets and poke it in here and talking and putting my shirt. Every pocket, believe me, I've forgotten now, several $1,000s. That day, I got over $10,000 cash that day that was given to me. I went down to Mr. Daniel's office at about 9 o'clock, and then I went back, and I want to tell you what happened. There's the peak of this talk this morning. But anyhow, I went down, and Mr. Charlie Daniels was waiting for me in his office, and when I went in the door, I saw tears running over his cheeks. Have a seat, Reverend. I sat down. He said, my heart is torn to pieces about your church. But I'll never forget, he did his hand like this, rest his soul today. He did his hand like this, and he said, listen, you don't worry about a thing. I'm going to get some men to draw a plan. I have a connection. I'll have the plan drawn just like you want. We're going to put it in. And he said, I'm going to pay for the materials that goes in that church cash. And he said, by paying for it cash, you won't only get it at wholesale, but 2% under wholesale. And said, I'm not going to make $1 on you. He said, I'm going to let my men build your church. It's going to take priority over everything. Build your church, and I'll just give you the labor bill. The labor bill. And that's what it's going to be. And as a matter of fact, he gave me, during the course of time when it's dedicated, he gave enough. He gave $3,500 of his personal money besides all this. And I was eternally grateful. But now let me tell you something. J.P. Morgan gave me $58,000. That was on that church, but he gave us something. From the first time I went down to see Mr. Henry, they started paying utility bills and so much a month. And it's just wonderful and marvelous how they stood by me. But this is something I want to tell you that helped me more than J.P. Morgan's, Charlie Daniels, or Harold Turner, or anybody else. Finally, I got loose and went to the house. And my sweetheart said, Earl, we've been getting telephone calls from all over the country. It said there's one telephone call came that you must answer. For I promised faithfully, says she's a widow woman, and I promised her faithfully when you came to the house that I'd have you call. I said, okay. Here's the number. I called, and the lady answered and said, Reverend Paulk, I'm a widow woman. I live in the slums of the city. I hate for you to come to my house, but I got a little grandson, Jimmy, little Jimmy, and said that he loves you so much. I had an early morning broadcast from 6 to 6:30 each morning, and said, she told me on the telephone, said, little Jimmy listens to your broadcast, sets the clock to alarm and listens, and said he's got something he wants to give you, and you must come. I said, all right, lady. God spoke to me, said, you go. I said, okay, and I left the businessmen, scores of them standing around there, newsmen, and I went across town and went to the slums, and I mean it was a slum. I found the little house. Door open, and she came. She had an apron on, poorly dressed. And she said, I hate to call you. You are Reverend Paulk? I said, yes, ma'am. Said, I never saw you, but I saw your picture in the paper, and said, this is Reverend Paulk. I said, yes, ma'am. Jimmy, come here, son. He came running, a little boy, 8 years old, and his overalls, the knee of his overalls was a hole this big, where it was not past, just a hole. The little knees was naked, where he'd been playing marbles. And he had the blackest feet that I ever saw in my life. It was blacker than mine when I was that age, playing in the creeks and the mud, and as I like to do. But little Jimmy came, and I don't believe it had a bath in a month. I never saw as dirty a child. But that grandmother said, this is Jimmy. and said his mother's forsaken him. I don't know where my daughter is, but he stays with me, and said, this morning when the telephone, when you came on, I went, see, I had a place to broadcast in the church, but this morning I had to go to this radio station. I said, good morning, greeting to everyone in the precious name of Jesus. I'm Brother Paulk, and I'm a sad pastor. My church is burning now. Little Jimmy heard that. He jumped up out of the bed and ran and was shaking his grandmother. Said, Grandmother, did you hear what Brother Paulk said? Said, yes, I heard it. He said, oh, Grandmother, said, call Brother Paulk and tell him to come over here. I want to give him my piggy bank to help build the church back. She told me that. And I looked down at little Jimmy, and he lifted his... I want to tell you something. I just love to tell it. He lifted his little arms up as though he wanted to hug my neck, and I got down on my knees, both of them, and he put his little arms around me, and he smelled terrible. And he put his little arms around me and squeezed me, but thank God for the hug. He whispered in my ear, just a trembling like he's in the presence of a king. He trembled and said, Brother Paul, I heard you tell about your church burning, and I got a little piggy bank I want to give you to help build your church. You know I didn't want to take it. You know that. I wanted to give him $1. But God said, take it, don't ask any questions. I said, thank you, son. Thank you, son. And I took it in my hands and went to the house and went in the room. There's 46 pennies in it. Not a nickel, not a dime, but 46 pennies. At that very time, you see, God can work on both ends of the line. Unbeknown to me, the radio station, I was on WFBC, Clear Channel station, then reached greater part of the nation, and the other station too, and they'd got together without my knowing, said, we got to do something for Reverend Paulk. And they decided they'd cancel all programs from 10 p.m. that evening till as long as I needed it. And at the same time, the manager of the station called the taxi cabs company and said, we want you to send scores of taxis down here this evening at 10 o'clock. Excuse me. Reverend Paul's coming. We're going to put him on the air and let him tell his story and see if people will help him, want to help him with his church. And we want you to have enough taxis here for him to put a friend or a member in each taxi so they can go and pick up the offerings. See, I didn't know that was going on. But later in the day, they called me and told me that. I said, fine, I'll be there, of course. So I went down, and there's 2-3 blocks. There was taxis on each side of the street, and the people, I put them in there and for them to go with the taxi driver. I got on the air, and the first story I told the story of little Jimmy. I told the story of him giving me his piggy bank and how many pennies is in there. My Lord, my Lord. Those telephones began to ring. Just ring, 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 and ring. And people said, come here. I want to give you an offer, $50, $100, $25, $200, $300. Consequently, that night I got over $10,000 again. Now it's 10 o'clock at night, and I've already got $20,000. All right. The next morning, a letter came, special delivery, and ran me down and said the order was, this must be delivered, must be delivered. And I opened it. That was from the president of a steel company out from Greenville. He said, dear Reverend Paulk, I regret so very much about your church burning, and our hearts are with you. And said, I heard the story of little Jimmy. And said, the least thing I could do is to give you a small check. And what do you suppose that check, the amount of that check was? $5,000. I want to tell you here and now that little Jimmy, and there's lots more to the story of little Jimmy, but it said, I want to tell you now, he did more than J.P. Morgan. He did more than Earl P. He did more than anybody, and rest his little soul this morning, to build back that great church that stands as a monument. And I want to tell you another thing. Well, I don't want to get ahead of that. All right, we got the church building there. It stands as a monument. I was over the last Sunday, last week for a funeral, and I go around and see these wonderful churches and auditoriums and sanctuaries over the country, but when I walk in that auditorium, if you've been into the Tremont Avenue, it just looked like heaven to me, to some extent. I know heaven would be far better than that, but it's just great, and it stands as a monument, and I'm so grateful to God. So I was then the vice president of the National Religious Broadcasters that did so very much that you don't know, many of you don't know what it meant and what religious broadcasting was going up against at the time that we got organized with the NAE, and National Religious Broadcasters was an arm of the NAE that I helped to be one of the first men that was privileged to begin with the NAE, as Dr. Kahn told me yesterday. He appreciated so much. And so I had to go as one of the officials. We was having a convention or get-together in Chicago. So I took the plane, went on up there, and I always let Addie Mae know where I am. So when I got situated that night, I called her and I said, honey, I'm in such and such a hotel, such and such a room, if you need me. All right. She said, I hope I won't need you. But I went on to the session that night and came back and had gone to bed and retired, and it's 1 o'clock and I was still awake. Telephone there close, and the telephone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Addie Mae. She said, was you asleep? I said, no. She said, I hate to call you. She said, I was afraid you might be asleep. But said, something awful has happened in Greenville. I said, honey, what in the world's happened? She said, little Jimmy got run over with a car and killed this afternoon. I said, you don't mean it? She said, oh, yes, he's killed instantly. She said, he's out in the street in front of them, and the car ran by and killed him instantly. I said, who has him? She said, McAfee's funeral home. I said, Addie Mae, you call Tom. You tell Tom that I said I want him to put little Jimmy away like he'd put his son away, or like he thinks that I'd put my son away. Don't spare. Give him the best. Put him in the finest suit it can be. Put him in the finest casket, the finest vault. Don't spare. I said, okay. And I said, you call the ladies' willing workers band and have them go over to that little place and clean it up and carry food there. Joe Milligan was my assistant pastor then. And I said, it's impossible. I'm to moderate the next morning. I cannot get there, honey. I just can't, but oh, I want to go. Tell Joe I said to see everything's okay. Okay. And do you know that little Jimmy was the first, I believe, yes, the first funeral in that great church that he had had so much to do in building. Tom McAfee put him in the finest casket, and the fine carpet on the floor. Little Jimmy's body was rolled down into that great church. You know, God has a way of rewarding. God has a way of working things. Great funeral. Great funeral. And little Jimmy is in paradise this morning. Let me say this before I finish that. I want to tell you, when I get to heaven, I want to see Jesus first. Jesus first. And there's some other people I'd like to see, like my little brother talked about. But after I see Jesus, I want to see little Jimmy one of the first. And this is how I believe heaven will be. It's as real as the sun that shines and is a city of God. Then, so as to speak, I want to walk down the streets of gold with little Jimmy and let him carry me to his mansion. I want to sit down, put my arms around his glorified body and say, little Jimmy, you don't know, son, what it meant to me that day and how you helped to build that great church. And little Jimmy, I'm glad you got your mansion. There won't be any cars racing the streets to run over you. You'll remain like you are as long as eternity shall exist, and that'll be forever. How wonderful. I want to tell you something, students. This thing of working for God, this thing of obeying God, means everything. Means everything. Now let me finish. So I came home. I said, Addie Mae, how did the funeral go off? I said, oh, Earl, it was great. It was great. I said, honey, I got to go down and see Tom McAfee now. I called Tom and he said, yes, I'm here, Brother Paulk, come on. He's, as you was out there to meet me, the biggest undertaker establishment in Greenville. He said, come, I want to show you something, Brother Paulk. He walked back in the room where he keeps his casket. He said, incidentally, he said, I got a casket just like I put little Jimmy in, and I want you to see it. And I got a suit of clothes like you that he said to me when he called me to go into ministry. I said, as Moses, I can't do it. I don't know anything about the Bible. I have no learning to speak of. I'm unlearned. I can't do it. I can't do it. Well, I didn't know what all God said to Moses. I didn't know that it was in the Bible. I know now what he said, but I didn't know. When God wanted Paul to go, he made excuses and fought against the pricks, but God finally got him to go. And the same God that helped Moses, and the same God that helped the Apostle Paul, the same God has helped me, and the same God will help you. He has no respect of person. He's the same to everyone. The God that has delivered me so miraculously. I think I'll venture to say this because I know time won't permit the other things that is going to take up my time, but I must say a little bit about a mob that mobbed me. I got to be fast. God spoke to me and said, you go in a certain community and build an arbor. And I went down there and by myself built an arbor, and nobody helped me, and Mr. Dudley let me build it, and I started a revival and disturbed the whole community and had a landslide and built a church, and the bootleggers got converted by the scores, and it was marvelous and great. And those that were having those fellas to make the liquor got mad and burned my church down and said, we're going to run that preacher off. They ran every preacher off before, but they didn't know who they was coming up against. I didn't have enough sense to be afraid. They said, we're going to stop him. And they came on a Monday. I found this out, and Pete Highsmith, that means nothing to you, but Judge Highsmith, Judge of the Superior Court, said, Earl, I know they're going to try to kill you. And said, we're going to stand behind you, but deputize anybody you want to. And so on a Sunday morning they came, 3 men, and tried to disturb the service, drank liquor, and ran their T-model car right out. I didn't have the windows, shutters on the windows, and just carried on until I got out of the pulpit. I tried not to have anything to do with him, and I went out there, and Pete Highsmith said, take your chain, and when they come to disturb, they'd get enough men to arrest them and chain them and bring them. And that's literally what we did. Three men came that morning, and we chained them, and yeah. And then they saw I was chained, and I wasn't afraid, and men was going to help me, and I helped myself. And they begged me to don't take them to jail, and I let them loose, and they said they'd behave, but oh God, I baptized a woman that afternoon. The mob came down there, but Joe Milligan, that don't mean anything to you. Joe was a man, whipped everybody in the country, and he was serving a time in the chain gang, and he was been off on the weekend and come along and heard the mob was going to try to kill me, and he thought lots of me, and they was afraid of Joe. And when I rolled up there, he said, Earl, you see that mob? I said, yes. He said, they're going to kill you. Think they are when you go to baptize this woman. He said, but I'll stand between you and them. I don't think they'll come on to you. They won't get you till they get me. And said, if I die, I'll go to hell. And you'll go to heaven, but I'm ready to go to hell to protect you. You see what God can do? And it's needless. It's needless to tell you, they didn't bother me. But my God, that night, Flanagan Tar came that afternoon drinking, and he said, I've heard the mob, Earl. They're going to kill you. Don't go tonight. I called the sheriff, and I called the 2 county police. I said, they're going to mob me tonight, meet me. And they met me. And they got out there in the dark, though, to hide. And we rolled down there on a truck, my wife and and my father-in-law and mother-in-law and a truckload of us to go in. They stopped us, and they came with shotguns. I saw shotguns, axe handles, men walking around with butcher knives in their hands, 38 pistols. You talk about the blood begin to fly, and I jumped out. They wanted me. But one of the leaders of the mob came face to face with me, and I saw his 38 here, and they were cutting over here, my brother-in-law, and knocked my father-in-law down, and it's terrible what was going on, but I stood face to face with Lee Harry. I felt somebody back up against my back, and I thought it was one of them was going to cut, but I was going to keep my eye on Lee. I knew when he pulled that pistol out, he'd never shoot me. I'd take it away from him. I knew I could do it. But we were standing like this, but I felt somebody back here, and Lee looked over my shoulder, and he turned and walked away. I never knew till 8 years who that was. But 8 years later, one of my wife's uncles was not afraid of anybody. He said, "Earl, you know the night that there was mobbing you, Lee was standing there going to kill you?" I said, "Yes, Tiny, I knew." He said, "That was me back of you," and said, "I had my 38, and said, I saw his 38, and said, I intended when he pulled it, I was going to shoot him right over your shoulder and shoot him in the face, and I'd drop down in the dark and crawl off. They'd never know who did it." But anyhow, I was saved, and the man they wanted, I didn't get a scar. He said, "That you may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I'll not fear what man can do unto me." That's what he said. Yeah. And I was delivered. I want to tell you the long story is the next Sunday, it was going to come, there like to have been a war in South Georgia. Pete Highsmith said, "Get all the men you wanted." And all. I spent a whole week in fasting and praying and didn't eat a bite because I knew there was going to be war. The next Sunday morning when I went down there, and I was determined to carry on my work and to establish that church, and thank God a big brick church stands there today, Church of God. The next Sunday morning they came, it looked like a big funeral, scores of cars filled with men loaded with guns, and they've been deputized, and even my father was a Baptist preacher, Freedom Baptist Church. He came and had his 38. That time came, and I knew if that war started to be like the McCoys and Hatfields, I knew it would have been. My God, you don't know what tents I was under. Those men came and said, "Earl, don't you be afraid. We'll stand there." And they put me in the last car, and they went all scores and scores of cars ahead of me, and I was crying. "Oh, God, you promised you'd be with me. You promised you'd help me. God, don't let a war start today." We rolled in, and the tabernacle was filled with people. And when we got seated, I saw the mob car come by, but when they saw those cars and saw all those men walking around, they went on. The story is, thank God, I go in that community. I preached some of those fellas' funerals. They're all dead but Lee. And he's an invalid today. I went to see him not long ago and prayed with him. God gave me the victory. And I think if any man is honored in that part of the country, I am. My God, how wonderful God can do, and what great things God will do. Young people, if you're called of God, trust God, be yourself, put your faith and trust in God. God knows no defeat. God is a God of victory and God of power, and he'll lead you. And let me say in closing, I don't want to go 1 second over, and I won't go 1 second over. I want to tell you, if you put your trust in God, there is no impossibilities with God. All things are possible to them who believe. Thank you.